And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 200. Sorry, mute that. Technicals, as usual. So episode 233 of Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. If you're wanting to improve your understanding of photography, you're in the right place. If you're wanting to improve your understanding of technicalities, technology, you're certainly in the wrong place. Probably in the wrong place if you're wanting to learn anything about presenting as well. However, here we are, live on YouTube, as you can tell. If you happen to be watching us, joining us live, and not watching the recording, then leave a comment over in the comment section. Say hello, tell me where you're from, tell me what you're up to, tell me what the weather's doing, and we can get the conversation started. Today we're going to be talking about the notion of camera angles, and actually lens choice as well, when it comes to doing portraits and portraiture. So, with that in mind, let's make a start. So yes, and welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 233, I think it is. I can see we've got a couple of comments in already, so let's make a start there, ground myself a little before we get going any further. First comment here is from Susan, saying she's not going to be here. Oh well, at least you let us know. What's she up to? She's off to Glasgow Airport to pick up her son. We'll catch up later. Oh well, I hope that all goes well for you, Susan. Nadia says, hi everyone from Fife. Fiji says, good evening from a humid Chennai in southern India. Adrian says, hi all from a reasonably overcast South Lincolnshire. Marilyn says, hello from Colorado. Meg says, hello everyone. April says, greetings from a mild and rainy day in Long Island, New York. Supposed to have winds up to 40 miles an hour later. We shall see. Nick joins us from the West Country in Bath, down in southern England, southwest England. Marilyn says, oh, April, we're just getting the storm you're just getting the storm we just had, wild winds. John says, hello from Ohio. And Marie McLaughlin joins us and says, thank you. So welcome, Marie. Today, and here in Castle Douglas, I have to say it's dull, overcast, grey. It's not raining. It's not cold as in Canada cold, but it's not particularly warm. It's around about sort of 6-7 degrees, and without the sun it feels really, it's that kind of damp cold. But there we go, that's what the weather's up to here. So what are we talking about? So today we're talking about the idea of camera angles and portraits, and this actually came from Nadia. This was a request from Nadia back at the turn of the year, and apologies for taking so long to get round to it, but Nadia won the accumulated Smug Points for December, and so what she wanted to use with them, she wanted to deal with a specific question of essentially when you take photos of people. She was kind of thinking of kids on one level, where sometimes you can make them look cuter if you're shooting from a slightly different angle, but you can kind of get mixed messages on what the best thing to do is. So I thought, well, okay, let's go through that. And so for one reason or another, partly to do with computers playing up earlier in the year, now we're getting round to this. So I started thinking about this notion of camera angles, and actually the angle, the height at which you photograph someone, can have a profound effect on the shape of their face and the view, the kind of emotional impact that it can have from the viewer as well. And I thought that was something worth investigating. So that's really what we're going to be talking about today. Quick update actually on the Smug Points while I think about it. Essentially what we're at now is halfway through March, and Nadia, Janet and Fiji are all on 35 Smug Points. Robert is on 30. So that's where we are at the moment. Now next week we have the challenge coming up, so I'm going to talk about that later on in the podcast, so stick around for that. And that's an opportunity to earn more Smug Points, 10 Smug Points if you enter into the challenge, with bonus for first, second and third choices as well. And then I'm going to be doing a feedback session for the last Sunday of the month, so there's that too. Another piece of housekeeping as well, just while I remember, is here in the UK, our clocks go forward on the 30th of March. So that's 2 weeks' time, which is also Mother's Day here in the UK as well. But 30th of March, so it's 2 weeks today, the clocks go forward. So that means if you're in North America, we catch back up to that same kind of time difference that you usually have for the rest of the year. If you're in India, then the clock is going to shift again, so I think it's going to be an hour earlier for you rather than an hour later. But double check that one, Google it, VG. I can't remember exactly which way round it goes, but I think it's in a 4-hour difference rather than a 5-hour difference for you. Right, okay, so Smug Points, time difference. Oh, one other piece, if he happens to tune in at some point, Robert in Texas, it's his birthday today, Facebook tells me. So happy birthday, Robert. Hope you have a good one. Right, okay, so let's get on then. And April says, yay, can't wait. Oh, that'll be to get the timing difference right. Yes, I guess it's tuning in just a little bit early for you on a Sunday morning, is it? Right, okay. So now what we're going to talk about then is this notion of camera angles and what difference it makes to a portrait. Now, there's a couple of different things going on here. Partly is to do with the angle you're at, but there's another thing which comes into this, which is to do with the distance you're at. And then that in turn makes a difference with what actual lens you're using as well. So your kind of lens depth as such, your focal length. Are you using a kind of a zoom lens from further away? Are you coming closer up with a wide angle lens? And your lens, that kind of focal length is going to also makes a huge difference to the effect that it has on the, not just on the bokeh, on the shape of the face. So really that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start running through with that. A couple of people saying happy birthday to Robert there. So what I thought I would start with here, and these are just, here's some test shots. In fact, part of this I only even really thought of this morning, so quickly added in. So I thought, well, what I wanted to do here was show you the difference. Let's just talk about aperture. Let's start off with aperture, okay? Because when you're taking a photo, aperture can make a huge difference if you happen to be in a place whereby you are not using a blank background. If you've got a all white background, all black background, some kind of backdrop, aperture is slightly less important in terms of worrying about the background interfering. But if you happen to be outside, then the aperture can make quite a bit of difference. So this morning what I did, I just literally went out into the garden with the camera and Meg. And I'll take you through what happened here. So if I flip over to here, what we can see here then, and no editing or anything else like that, this is just what I've done is I've got a camera and I'm using, at this point, I've actually got my 200 to 70 to 200 millimeter lens on my camera, but we're back out at 70 millimeters. Now I'll talk a little bit later about what 70 millimeters is generally a kind of usual portrait length in portrait photography. I'll explain a little bit more about that afterwards. Jeffrey's joined us as well. Also says happy birthday to Robert. So you're working at 70 millimeter length. Now what I've done is I've got an aperture of f/22. Okay, so I've got the narrowest aperture I can get on that particular lens. And what that means is that we can see Meg's perfectly in focus, and the rest of the garden, which is now coming towards the end of winter, spring isn't fully here yet. There's might be a tiny little splash of a hint of a daffodil just up here. I think that may be yellow spot, but mostly what we're talking about is a garden that's going to be needing its first lawn mowed and tidying up and all the rest of it. So forgive the state of the garden, I suppose that's where I'm trying to get to. But you can see a lot of it as well as Meg. So that's at an f/22. But if I start to widen that aperture and I go to say an f/16, there's a little bit of difference. If you look at the shed behind, the shed goes slightly less in focus. And then if I go to an f/11, the background is now starting to blur up a bit more. If I go to an f/6.3, so I'm now making it wider again, we can really start to notice a difference that the background is getting blurrier and blurrier. The focal length, the depth of focus rather, the depth of focus is changing as we open our aperture. So as the aperture gets wider, the depth of focus gets narrower. Okay. As I go to, what's this? This is an f4.5, blurrier again, to an f2.8. Okay. Now, when we get to an f2.8, the background has really got quite blurry, and it's really separated Meg out from the background. So very often you find that when you're doing some kind of, when you're doing portraiture, a wide aperture can help separate the person from the background, especially if you're in a sort of slightly busy background. This is before we've done any other kind of editing to it. All I've done here is take the photo. The only edit I've done is to crop so that the faces are all basically the same place. Now, the other thing to remember about your depth of field, how much is going to be in focus, whether it's a lot in focus or just a little bit in focus, a narrow plane in focus, is that if you zoom in, the more you zoom in, the more that becomes compressed. Okay, so this shot here is at 2.8, so as wide as I can get, 2.8 at 70 millimeters. But that's a 70 to 200 millimeter lens that I've got. So I'm going to go to 200 millimeters and I'm going to zoom in. So a step back further, zoom in, so that I get the same proportions, and I end up with that. Okay, now the background here is much more out of focus. Okay, can you see that? That from here, it's still a 2.8, but this is 2.8 as 70 millimeter focal length, and this is 2.8 at a 200 millimeter focal length. So if you really want to blur the background, then actually standing further back and zooming in will give you a narrower depth of field than if you're closer in and zoomed out, if that makes sense. April says, I like the blurred background. Yeah, well, that's part of it. Yes, the blurred background really adds to, it brings all your attention into the face. Whereas something like this becomes an environmental portrait, so it's Meg in the space. So you're looking at this picture of Meg, but you're very aware that she's in the garden. And so the garden becomes part of the narrative. Whereas when we get to this, you barely know it's a garden. There's a bit, well, if you know it's a garden, you know there's obviously the green is going to be the grass, a little bit of blue at the back is probably the shed, but only if you already happen to know it's the shed. And if I put this into black and white, you wouldn't necessarily know what was in the background at all. Okay, so that notion of how much you're zooming in and how wide your aperture is going to make a difference. Now you don't have to, I'm not asking you to remember the specifics now, there's no point in scribbling down your nose. But what I would say is to understand the principle of it, so that when you come to taking photos, if you're going to be taking photos of your grandchildren, your nephew, your niece, your parents, out doing a bit of street photography, any kind of situation, if you're wanting to separate out your subject from the background and you're wanting to create a narrow depth of field, then you're better off having as wide an aperture as you can and zooming in from a distance, okay, rather than necessarily getting up close. If you get up close, then you're and you want the same proportions, then you're going to end up not, the background's going to be more prominent in it as well, for the same amount of ratio of head to background, that is. Okay, so hoping that makes a little bit of sense to you. Let me just grab a. Feel free to ask questions as we go, or if anything I'm saying doesn't quite make sense, ask for clarification. It's perfectly fine to do that. Okay, so that's one of the things talking about just purely the notion of sort of depth of focus, which is, so your depth of focus is influenced by your aperture. The wider your aperture, the narrower your depth of focus, and by the amount you zoom in. And if you're zooming in from a distance, then it compresses that depth of focus further. Okay, so 2.8 on one lens isn't the same as 2.8 on another. So if you've got that bit, understood that bit, I'm going to now move on to the next bit, which is about your choice of lens. Now, one of the things I said a couple of minutes back is this notion that a 70mm lens, generally speaking, is around about, or 50 to 70, depending on the camera you've got, tends to be what we think of as a normal or a reasonable kind of portrait length lens. Actually, Adrian's just asked a question here. It says, does this feature zooming alter the facial profile as in the shape and the roundness? Yes, it absolutely does, and that's exactly what I'm just about to come on to, Adrian. So good point. So this point then of because precisely what Adrian's just said, if you get closer, the head tends to distort a little bit. So if you think of from here, you can. Now already this is a slightly wide angle lens because this isn't the way you see me every week on these podcasts. My head is slightly distorted because of the webcam that I'm using. Okay, the further back I go, the more distance I put between. Now the problem is with being back here is essentially I'm now quite small on the screen, so I have to kind of fill the screen a bit more. But the shape of my head is changed slightly. If the further back I am, if you can see both ears much more clearly. As I get closer, my ears kind of disappear to tiny little points. My nose becomes larger proportionally to the size of my head. So I'm getting distorted. And that distortion is one of these things. It's well known with our phones. Everybody who's doing selfies, these things tend to have a built-in kind of, their default is a wide angle lens because they're trying to get as much of the scene in as possible. And because it's a wide angle, it tends to distort the faces. So everybody who's showing their selfies up on social media never really looks like them. They have a distorted version of their face. So let's show you exactly what that means, right? In terms of, now another set of photos I did these ones with Meg last week. And so this means that I had time to sort of sit and edit them a little bit. And I thought, well, okay, I've just gone for a plain background and I decided to do some black and white portraits of Meg. So let's flip over to here. And so this is a standard kind of studio setup. Basically, I had a white fleece backdrop sitting out on the back on my door in my study, and I decided to take a photo. Now, with this one, I used my big zoom lens again, except for the fact that because my study isn't big enough, I couldn't do 200mm. Standing as far back on the opposite side of the room as I could zooming in, this one is taking it at 145mm. Okay, so now what we're talking about is the size of your focal length, right? So the focal length of 145mm is this mix. So then what I did was I then swapped over from this and I put on my 70 to 24. So now I go from 24, which is starting to get a bit wide angle, to 70mm. And I put that on and we go to this. Now, apart from the fact the hair is slightly different and what have you, it's more or less the same. There's not a lot of difference with Meg in this picture. So if I go back to here, so that's 145mm, that is 70mm. Now there is it's slightly difficult to tell, I realise actually, because in this one Meg's hair's on her side of her face a bit more, here it's pulled back a little bit, but actually her face is starting to widen just a little bit at the front in this shape, but not enough. And there is this thing, depending on the kind of camera, if you're using a full frame camera, then 70mm is about as short as you want to get. Once you start getting low, if you go down to 50mm, you go down to 25mm, anything is like that, this is where the face starts to distort. But over 70mm, and you can, it doesn't really, there's not a lot of difference here between 70 and 200, okay? So 70 tends to be your sort of starting point. Some people like a 100mm lens, can also give quite a nice kind of distance as a portrait lens. If you've got a crop sensor camera, if you don't understand any of these technicalities, don't worry about it. It's not bothering you. It won't affect you. But for those who've got a DSLR of some kind, if they've got a crop sensor tends to have a slightly different ratio. So actually a 50mm lens, you can get away with a 50mm lens will work quite well as a portrait lens on a crop sensor, but on a full frame it's not quite enough. You really need 70 plus for that. Okay, so where are we? So we're with Meg here, and so this is Meg. Now, just for this one, I stuck it at, this is an f6.3. Okay, so that I didn't have to worry about anything going out of focus. It's the same depth on all of these. So this then is 70 millimeters on my 70 to 24. But then what I did was I moved closer and pulled back out. Okay, so the same head ratio to picture, but with a 46. So I've gone from 70 to 46, and it started to move it this way. And you might notice that Meg's face is starting to push out. So this is what I mean. Once you start going below 50, it's starting to distort a little bit. Okay, and then I moved closer, and I went 24 millimeters. So I'm now going from my 70 to 24, I'm going as wide as I can on that, and we now get to here. Okay, so you can really see the difference by the time we go from 46 millimeters to 24 millimeters. Okay, so same girl, same lighting, same aperture, same shutter speed, different focal length on the camera. Okay, so I'm creating the same, she's filling the same amount of the frame, face to background ratio is the same, but the proportions have changed within it. And this is the bit that I'm really trying to get across. This is the bit which it becomes really important. So then what I did was, after going to the 24, I thought, well, hang on a second, I've got a proper wide angle lens, which is a 15 to 35. So I put that on, and I went back to this one. So this is 35, so not quite as distorted as the 24, but more distorted than the 46. So I should probably swap those two around. Difference here again, Meg's put her hair behind one ear on this one. But 35 millimeters, we are definitely into the distorted region. Then what I did was I went to 20 millimeters, which is wider than I could get on my previous lens. And now you can see what I mean about, like, the head, the nose is coming forward, the ears are pushing back. You're seeing even less. And then I went as wide as I could with my wide angle lens, which was 15 millimeters on a full frame camera, and we end up with this. So this is the same girl under the same lighting conditions as this, where this one is 145 millimeter focal length. This one is a 15 millimeter. And so what a difference. What a difference. This then is why your focal length is so important, and your choice of lens when you come to taking a portrait becomes so important. What's this? Fiji says, Dad got a beautiful and willing model at home. Lucky you, Kim. Yes. Absolutely. I am extraordinarily fortunate that every time I want to try something out, Meg is more than happy to allow me to take photos of her. So yes, very useful indeed. Okay, let's just close those for the moment. Viji says also, the difference is so pronounced. Good tips. Yeah, excellent. I really wanted to show you that visual difference so you can really get that sense of. And in essence, it shows you again why we tend to be quite limited with doing portraits with these things. If you wanted to do a proper portrait with this, you are better off standing further back and using a zoom function. The problem is with the zoom on these is mostly it tends to be a digital zoom, not an optical zoom. So by zooming in, you essentially lose, it's a bit like zooming in on the computer, you lose a number of pixels to be able to, you're losing real estate, you're getting a lower quality image. And unless you can actually, you buy one of these little things where you get actual optical lenses which you can clip onto your phone to zoom in a bit closer, then at that point standing further back and zooming in is going to give you a better picture, generally speaking. But now maybe you understand why everybody's selfie with one of these always looks distorted. Meg saying thank you to Viji. So, with that in mind then, so what we talked about so far is the notion of the aperture you're using is going to make a difference to what's in focus. And also, whether you're zooming in or further out is going to make a difference to the compression level of your depth of focus if you're wanting to have a blurry background. But then what we're also talking about is being closer in is going to distort the face more. The wider angle you have, the more it distorts, the closer you get. It becomes exaggerated. So your aperture, your distance, and your choice of lens and your focal length all have an impact then on just how the face is actually going to look. So the next thing I want to talk about is the notion of camera angle, height. Where are you standing in relation to the subject? Are you above it? Are you level with it? Are you below it? Now, an interesting aspect to this is, for a lot of people who've never thought about it, the automatic thing to do is they just take everything from eye level because that's how they see the world. Okay, so when they take a photo of their lunch, they take it looking down at 45 degrees because they're sitting at the table and that's how they're looking at their lunch. They don't think to photograph it from above, they don't think to photograph it from side on, they just photograph it from eye level. But they also do the same with people. Now, I remember this several years ago, chatting to a landscape photographer I know, who's quite tall. So he's about 6'2", something like that. And out in the landscapes, your height makes very little difference. The difference between somebody who's 6 foot and 5 foot tall makes virtually no difference unless you're trying to see over the top of a hedge, right? So he's never really thought at all about his own height. And what happened was he was asked to photograph a friend's wedding. And so he turned up and he took a bunch of photos and he did his photography. And when I saw the photos, I suddenly realised all the photos looked odd to me. All the photos looked like they'd taken from higher up than they should be. And that's because I'm only 5'6", he's 6'2". So all his pictures were taken from 8 inches above the way that I'm used to seeing the world. And that's a really interesting point to take, a point to take on board, which is your height is unique to you and everybody else who's your height. But you don't necessarily have to take photos from your height, your angle. And there's an old thing which is about the notion of if you're ever photographing pets or children, the very first thing you need to do is actually get down to their height. And it's that sort of sign of the unknowing photographer, the person who've got their camera or their phone and they've never thought about it, that all the photos of their pets, all the photos of children, grandchildren, whatever, are always taken looking down at them. And is that necessarily the best way to do it? So for example here, if I clip over to here, so here's a picture of my grandson. This was taken a few years ago when we were at the beach. So now if you think normally about the way you might photograph a child on the beach, if you're standing at adult height, you'd be looking down. I can't remember when this was taken, but I think Alfie's probably about 2 years old at this point or thereabouts. But what I did to get this was I got down at his level. And when you get down at his level, it's a different picture. It's a very, very different kind of picture than if you're standing up looking down. It also then gives you the option. In fact, actually, I'm not just at his level. I've gone fractionally below if I look at this one, so that I'm getting much more of the sky in the background. Now, if you're standing at adult height looking down at a child, you're never going to get the sky in the background. In fact, you won't even get the sea in the background. All it will be is the sand behind you. So that getting down to the child's level fundamentally changes how the photo is going to turn out. Another quick example here, pets. This is not my dog, this was the dog of a client, so I was photographing. In fact, you can just about make out her sitting on the sofa behind. But her dog, again, to take a photo of the dog, not to be standing up looking down at a dog, but kneeling down and getting an eye level shot of the dog. It gives you a completely different feel to the portrait. Okay. So this then becomes a really interesting thing. If you're taking a photo of something smaller, change your height level. So that changing the height, we're not necessarily talking about camera angle so much, but at this point, just that notion of changing height. Are you going to be level with the person that you're photographing, or are you going to be above them? Or are you going to be below them? So now what we're going to do then is move on to this notion of actual camera angle. Once you've decided you're going to photograph someone, do you want to make a conscious choice, not an unconscious choice, but a conscious choice to shoot from above or shoot from below? Because when it comes to faces, that will also change what's going on. Because a fundamental thing here is, unless you only have one eye, we see in 3 dimensions. Right? We've got depth vision. 2 eyes creates a sense of depth. So that when you're looking with 2 eyes, if I have my hand here, if I move my hand closer like this, you know that my hand is closer to you, not just that I have a very big hand in relation to my face. However, part of this, when we've only got 2 dimensions, like you're looking at on the screen now, you know, because you've already seen me move my hand forward and that it gets bigger as it goes, that it's not that I've got a huge hand. But if you just this moment turned on to this podcast and you didn't know me and you hadn't seen this, it's not necessarily that clear whether my hand is further forward or whether I just have a very big hand. You'll probably assume, but you can't guarantee. You can't be entirely sure how big my hand would be to my face naturally. You wouldn't be able to reverse engineer it until you see some other kind of movement. Likewise, when I kind of pull back like this to try and, is now, it could look like I've got a very small head. In relation to my body is much bigger than my head. Okay, so little pinhead person sitting over here. It's not necessarily that obvious unless you already know, unless you've seen the shot before, maybe the shot afterwards, and your brain is filling in the details. So when you look at a photo that is flat 2-dimensional, and you don't have any other reference points, you haven't seen the shot before, you haven't seen the shot afterwards, then you can't be entirely sure what the actual proportions should be. Okay, what's Nick saying? Something there says, so if you are tall, should you bend down a little to get a more normal angle? Yes, basically, you're better off either squatting a bit, sitting on a chair. But the main thing here is to be aware of the unintentional bias of looking at things. So if you happen to be 6 foot tall, Nick, or 6'6", then be aware of your unintentional bias that you're not even aware of because you've always seen the world this way. So it doesn't occur to you to see the world another way. But if you're aware of that bias, then yes, you lower yourself. So like those photos of Meg is shorter than me. I'm 5'6" or thereabouts. Meg's about, I can't remember, 4'10", 4'11", I think. So in order to be able to shoot straight on, I had to lower myself to make sure that I wasn't accidentally looking down on her with that. So what happens then, though, if you decide that you're going to intentionally now shoot from underneath or shoot from above? And this is the point that I was trying to get to here, which is actually the proportions change. So let's show you a straight on photo of Meg. Okay, so straight on photo of Meg, as we said, this one's like with 70mm shot or something like that, so that there isn't really any distortion. This is kind of what she looks like. But if I decide to shoot from below, the proportions of the face change. Now what happens is the jaw and the chin become larger in proportion to her eyes. Her eyes seem smaller, narrower. The forehead becomes smaller. The jaw becomes larger. Now, sometimes what you can do is you can make a deliberate choice about this, because there's another thing about this, which is there's also a power dynamic here. Meg here is literally above us. She is looking down at us. So whilst this is a slightly exaggerated version, Sometimes when you're doing portraits, if you want to do a power shot, if you want to do a shot of somebody looking a little bit more important, you can shoot from slightly below. Now, I wonder if so for example, I'm not going to put the picture up here because I'm never entirely sure of copyright issues. But if you think of, I mean, I always remember whenever I used to see pictures of Obama, okay, the American president, when he was in power, they were always shot from slightly below. And it has this double effect. One is he is literally above us, which gives us this sense of he's important, he's the boss, he's looking down on us. The other is this ratio thing. The jaw looks larger in proportion to the eyes, okay? And generally speaking, it's a more masculine trait to have a larger jaw. Evolutionary wise, accentuated by having beards. Whereas, generally speaking, a narrower jaw tends to be a slightly more feminine trait. So if you think of that kind of dominant masculine power shot, then shooting from slightly below gives you more of that kind of feel. Now, let's compare this to, so what if we shoot from above? Now we shoot from above, completely different feel. Okay? Proportionally, Meg's eyes are now closer to the camera than her jaw was. Whereas in this one, her jaw is closer to the camera than her eyes are. So, same girl, same lighting, same aperture, shutter speed, all the rest of it. Very different feel. Now we're looking down at Meg. But on top of that, as well as the fact that we're looking down, Meg has had to open her eyes wider. If she's looking down, her eyes are narrower. As she bends up, she has to open her eyes to look up. So her eyes actually now seem even larger. And so proportionally, her eyes are larger and her jaw is now much more oval. Okay, so the difference between a kind of larger, wider, squarer jaw and a narrow oval jaw, the difference between narrow eyes looking down, wide eyes looking up, the difference is phenomenal. And on a conscious or unconscious level, you'll tend to find that most, certainly young women, have understood this a lot. And it's like the selfies that are on Facebook, the vast majority are taking their selfies from up here. Vast majority of young women, not just so much young women either, young to middle-aged women, I would say, tend to take their photos from up here. And it's because you're then making the eyes slightly larger, you're narrowing the jaw. Certainly if you have anything sort of like some kind of slightly double chin or something about your neck that you're less happy with, that tends to get hidden because of the angle it's at as well. Okay, so this camera angle can make a fundamental difference to the perception. Now that's what's the next say? I can see what you're saying. It's more feminine when you're looking down, and and it is. It's just the way we've been programmed, partly evolutionary wise, but also partly the way we've been fed through our social media and through our media and through our cultural heritage and way things have been placed towards us. We tend to think of it as more feminine from a mass. Generally speaking, of course, there's all the exceptions. Men tend to be slightly taller than women. So there's this whole thing of men tend to look slightly down on women, women tend to look slightly up on men. Now, we can talk about the rights and wrongs in a cultural sense. That's not what this conversation is about. This conversation is about our kind of defaults, which we can then we can override it with our cultural understanding. But our defaults tend to be this way. So men tend to be slightly bigger, tend to have slightly wider jaws on average. Women tend to be slightly smaller, tend to have slightly larger eyes, slightly narrower jaws on average. Okay, so these become our defaults and our stereotypes and the first place that our head goes to. So when we see a photo like this, Meg seems to look more feminine in this than she does in that. Okay, so this notion then of camera angle, are we looking up at someone when we take the photo, are we looking down on someone when we take the photo, has a profound effect. Not just Meg, let's show you what happens when we do it with me. I did the same thing, only this time I did the selfie because I wanted to see what it looked like here. So with this one, here's a shot of me. Now, because I'm using this, we've got that distorted. Okay, my face is in fact slightly wider than it appears here. But doing that, holding the camera up, kind of this angle to do the shot, we get this, okay? So with this one here, my eyebrows make a big feature. My jaw is slightly narrower. We're looking down at me, I'm looking up. Now, when I shoot from below, looking up, it changes it more. My jaw is now more prominent, my beard is closer, my forehead is distinct. Now I've got quite a large forehead, accentuated more by the fact that I'm going thin on top as well. But it's a different dynamic, it's a different power dynamic, there's a different feel to it as the fact, and in this one, I'm looking down on you. In this one, I'm looking up to you, or you're standing over me. So, just, with Meg, you get this effect. With me, you get this effect. Okay, and this is true for everyone. So if you're ever actually doing, as a professional photographer, I need to understand this, because sometimes when I'm taking a photo, there's a notion that I always say that whenever somebody comes to me for a portrait, the first questions I tend to ask them are, who's going to be looking at this photo, and what reaction do you want from the person who's looking at this photo? So there's a different dynamic. If I'm taking a photo of somebody who is the CEO of an important company, or wanting to come across in that way, then maybe, as well as the kind of drop shoulders and the, stand up straight to attention and that wearing a suit and tie or whatever. But what I might do is actually shoot from slightly below, so that you have that slightly more authoritative power stance or structure. And not massively, but just slightly. Not enough for anybody to consciously know it unless they are specifically looking for it. But you'll subconsciously, people will get fed this position, this idea of a slightly more powerful person. Or, alternatively, if you're wanting to come across as, say, welcome to my cafe, which is a place to come and hang out, to pour out your woes, it's really friendly, lovely cake, welcome. And if it's welcome, come to me, then I put myself in a slightly more subservient position. So we shoot from slightly above, so that I'm slightly below you, warm, smiley, friendly, but that little kind of tilt of the head down, shooting from slightly above, removes any kind of barrier of, I don't want to go to that place because I might be intimidated. We're trying to move away from intimidation and into warmth and acceptability and connection. Okay, so that tilt of up and down, even subtly, can make quite a difference to the viewer. Let me just. There's a couple of comments there that I can't quite make out on the tablet. Marie says, very interesting, and Nick says, telling the story is affected by the angle you take the photo in. Yeah, absolutely. So once you understand the story you're wanting to tell, that's going to affect the angle at which you're going to use the camera, as well as the focal length you're going to use and the distance from which you shoot and the amount of aperture you want to use. All these things are kind of feeding into the story that you want to get across. So let's show another example then here of where I did a photograph for a tailor. This one was done for Dumfries and Galloway Life magazine. So some of you may have seen some of these photos before, but it was a few years ago. So Andrew Livingston is fourth generation tailor across the road in Castle Douglas. And we wanted to get a shot of him standing outside his shop with the suits in the background. And what I also wanted to do was there was bits of reflections I wanted to get in the window as well. And all these things combined to the fact that what I did was I shot from slightly lower down. So let's just show you what I'm talking about here. So when I did this shot here, so we've got the tailor in front of his shop. Also reflected in the windows, we've got the rooftops of the buildings that are behind me, and you can see, the street as it kind of disappears down here. And part of this, again, if you look in the kind of distorted, you kind of make out the bits. There's a Scottish architecture to this. This is a Castle Douglas street. The architecture isn't the same if you were in England or in other parts of Europe. There's much more of so it's, again, very subtle. If you happen to be noticing, you've got the reflection of the Scottish town in the windows, but you can see through the windows and you can see the suits that are in there. And then we've got Andrew himself in his beautifully tailored suit, but I'm shooting up. And it gives this sense of ownership, of pride, of strength, of authority. This guy is a top tailor. He trained in Savile Row. He comes from a line, he's the 4th generation of tailors who have been award-winning and what have you. So that kind of thing gives him this authority to know that if you went to him to get your suit tailored, made for you, you're in good hands. Okay, and that kind of shows you where we were coming from. That another shot I did where I deliberately went low as well was when we did a shoot inside the shop, and this one I just wanted to get a shot of where all the lights were for a different setup, and I got a big softbox above him, I got another light over there, and I wanted to kind of show this shot was to remind me where I'd placed the lighting for another shot. But in order to get the lighting in, I went down low, and now he's a giant. I've really gone low here, and again, it changes the feeling. What have we got here? Oh, Marie says, now I understand why photographers kneel down on the floor. Yes, absolutely. You will get people who, some of them will lie right down on the floor to shoot up to get a particular kind of angle. Okay, let's show you something else here. This is a little bit of fun. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of, for those of you who noticed the episode card cover for this podcast, you might have noticed that, so it's a couple of drag queens in Dumfries who I've done a photo shoot with. And I think probably might be next month I'll talk about these, show you the rest of the photos. But I thought, you're going to get a taster for them now, because that shoot was one where I really was using this idea of camera angle to a particular effect. So let's start here with, this is the selfie. So we're out on this sort of rooftop level in Dumfries, and here we've got Madam Joe on the right. Over on the left we've got the Divine Tension. Okay, and there in the middle, me. Now, the thing about both Divine and Madam Joe is they are big, right? I mean, I met Madam Joe first, and they are over 6 foot tall. But then Divine Tension is probably about 6'4", is even bigger, even taller. And so you have this wonderful contrast with these drag queens of that, on the one hand, the ultra feminine dress, makeup and what have you, but they are also incredibly masculine in their femininity as well. So we've got the hairy chest, we've got the beard, right? So there's this wonderful kind of contrast going on, which really adds to the image and the power dynamics and everything about the personas that have been created. Now me, I'm only 5'6", so I'm just this tiny little person stuck between these giants. That was kind of fun. But let me show you then. One of the shots that we did was this one. We wanted to have this sort of sense of, it was like a party on the rooftop. And now, because they are taller than me, my default ends up being shooting up. But at this point, what we were wanting to do was we were wanting to get a bit of the Dumfries horizon into the shot. It was taken during the day, but on a dull day, sun was sort of, you could just about see a little bit of sunbeam coming through in the background there. It was fairly overcast, but what I did was I created, for anybody's interested, I created a lighting setup. So just behind me to the left, I've got the key light, but I've also got a flash with a blue gel inside the door, just kind of coming out, making it look a bit like a party, but also catching a little bit of blue on the dress and the edges of the face. I'll talk more about actually the technicals of what I was doing when I come around to talk about this shoot. But in order to get the height here, I actually had to go back. So this barrier, suddenly forgot what you call it, banister, fence. It's not fair. Words gone straight out of my head. Anyway, this thing here to stop you falling over the edge of the balcony, the rail. Basically, what I did was, where I am here, I had to sort of sit up on it. So I'm perfectly safe. I'm not going to topple off backwards, but I'm actually sitting up on this rail behind here, so that I can essentially be at the same height as them, as I make the shot, and that also allows the Dumfries skyline and the town buildings and what have you to be in the background. And that was okay. But then there was something interesting. I really started exploring, we started talking about this idea, about the fact that both of them are tall. They are tall and they are imposing figures. And I decided, well, what happens if I, not just my height, which will be looking at them, but I do exactly what Maria was talking about, which is to get down on the floor and really look up and have that kind of giant level of them. What would that look like? And I did this. Stop worrying about the horizon and actually more have this power imposing kind of thing. And it just felt brilliant. It felt like, oh yes, this is capturing something here. And when I showed them this in the back of the camera, they both got really excited as well. And we decided to do a whole bunch of shots where really I was then shooting up. Because then what we are doing is we are intensifying that juxtaposition between the ultra femininity of the drag queen with the dresses and the hair and the makeup, well, the hair with divine tension at any rate, and the makeup, with the height and the broadness and the power of kind of an ultra masculinity that you have with the beard and the hairy chest and just sort of sheer dominance as well. And just loving that kind of contradiction between what you're expecting. And by coming down low and deliberately shooting up, you feel sort of this sort of sense of giants. You're standing amongst giants. So it was fun to kind of play around with that idea. What have we got here? Nadia says, is it correct that if ladies looking up to the camera slightly, it can be more flattering to the... Got behind there, one sec, I'll have to see what it... could be more flattering to the neckline. No, not necessarily. What you're talking about here is if you go up there, yes, what you're doing, you're stretching the skin, okay? So in a way, if you're looking up, you're stretching the skin. So if you've got, I don't know, slightly more scrawny necks or wrinkles or anything like that, or even sort of slightly double chin, then yes, you're stretching it slightly. However, you are running against the fact that when you pull up, you're then making the jaw bigger. So actually, what you're better off doing is dropping your shoulders, shooting from, if you want really, that's the more feminine, shoot from slightly above, but allow the woman to sort of drop the shoulders and then just actually stretch by push the back of your jaw out like that. Now, if you push the back of my jaw out, then that stretches the skin across here as well. If I kind of push down like that, then what happens is the jowls push up into here. Because if I drop the shoulders, it stretches the skin. And if I stretch the neck out, just push my jaw out slightly, then that allows... So actually lean forward a little bit and then stretch the neck that way. Don't stretch the neck out and point up, because then you're looking up the nose and you're making a larger jaw and narrow eyes. So hope that one makes sense, Nadia. What else have we got? VG says you should have been excited to photograph the drag queen, such great stature. Yeah, it was a hugely fun shoot. Adrian says, if this is next week, then please ignore. Could you have gone to the 9th degree and really gone low, also a few feet from the shoes, to do that kind of portrait orientation? It's not going to be next week. It will be a few weeks before I do this. I mean, there was a sense whereby actually to get that shot as was, I was already down on the floor. I know where you're going, but I'll tell you what, I will show you in a few minutes. Stick around long enough, Adrian, and I'm going to show you a couple of shots where I did that. Not with the drag queens, but with in another situation. Because let's go back then to... I'll just show you another shot that I did with them as well, 2 shots, to show you again the difference between playing around with a camera angle. So this one, we'd done a shoot up on the rooftop balcony, and then we went into a pub, place called the Doogie Arms in Dumfries. I did a bunch of shots in there, and this one here we've got Divine up on the bar, Madam Joe standing in front, and here I'm shooting basically, it's eye level, it's sort of straight onto them, and playing around here with the lines, the form, the shape, and it's a good composition. I like this one. It's a fun shot. But then after doing several shots like this and variations, which again I'll show you when I get around to talking about this shoot, I also decided, well, what it would be like again to go low. And I did this one, and this one is the one that you will have seen on the card cover for this episode. And so again, now we've got, okay, so we swapped them around. This time Divine's behind the bar and Adam Joe's up on top of it. But they're now looking down at us again. And it's a real, again, such a change in the power dynamic. You know, in this one, we're looking straight on at them. With this one, they are totally dominating. You know, whether it reminds you of being 14 years old trying to go into a pub and get served, pretending that you're older and just being looked at with absolute condescension by the barman. Whatever, it's a kind of a fun scene, and I like this idea of looking up. So that notion then becomes quite important. A couple of other examples then is where what you do is now, I've talked about this notion of... So the looking up is going to make a difference. So looking down is making a difference. We also talked about the notion that when you had a wide angle lens and you get in close, it distorts. And generally speaking, when we're doing portraits, we're trying to move away from that. So we want to stand further back. For a normal portrait, we stand further back and zoom in. And we try and be more or less kind of level with the person that we're photographing. But what we can do is, if we want to stylize and we want to have fun and we really want to kind of disorientate the viewer, is to use the wide angle up or below and really start playing around, because it will distort and play. So let me show you here what I mean. So again, I did some shoots a couple of years back now. I think I gave a talk about a set of photos I did inside a very small alcove. So there was a fashion show going on. There was this tiny little alcove where I could just grab some people, and I had enough room for one light up behind me and very little space. So I decided that I would go stylized. So I put on my wide angle lens onto my camera, and then I swapped. So we switch over to here. So this picture of Eva, she's got her outfit she's wearing. So I'm now sort of standing on a stool, looking down, wide angle lens, and it creates this sort of really close in with the arms. The wide angle is distorting. We can see how, you know, the lines are sort of running down the left here, running down to the right there. We know that if you're standing there, these are parallel lines, but they get distorted by the wide angle camera, and it creates this very close, almost claustrophobic, really in there sense of what's going on. But then what I did was I went down low and shot up, and then again, this is me basically lying on the floor looking up, and completely different feel. So now she's all length body, and that hat and head are really small, and you again, you know, so, and the wide angle is accentuating that a little bit more. Another ones that I did for this couple, particularly now, these are, so they've got whole circus performance acts as well that they were playing around with. And so by putting Kate here, she's actually sort of standing on a little bit of bench there, but playing around with arm angles coming out here, these all get exaggerated. We're looking right down. I'm really trying to get the camera as high as I can to point down on them, and we're getting this distortion. So by using the distortion of the wide angle and getting in close, we're really playing with the energy and the dynamism and the distortion, and it feels like there's so much going on. It really, there's such an energy in there, and an unsettling, a kind of disruptive, throwing you off kilter kind of thing. It's not staid, it's not calm. There's nothing calm about these kind of images. VG says, wow, Meg says, that's incredible. Now, another set of shots, again from a couple of years back, one or two of you may remember, I did in a white cube space. So another photographer I know, he's got this sort of 3 metre by 3 metre, or it might even be 4 metre by 4 metre cube white painted spot, which is, if you're doing particular kinds of fashion shoot, is fun. And with that, to try and make things interesting, I got out the wide angle lens as well. So with this one, for example, and this is a little bit more, I think, going back to was it Adrian's idea of kind of really getting down at floor level and getting the shoes in. And so here what we really notice then is that we've got her so that her leg is tucked underneath and one foot's coming closer, and the wide angle lens is really creating this distortion. So this foot, by comparison to the head, is absolutely huge. So everything's become really distorted, and it changes, and it's throwing you off kilter, and it's making you look at it and then look at it again. Okay, so that combination of wide angle lens and getting in close can be fun. And likewise, we did another one where we did, Vigi says, oh, incredible, I remember this shot. What we can also do though is shooting from above. So here we have that other thing, a bit like we were getting in the alcove, but in some ways, but because we've got the white background, where the head now and the legs and the whole body disappears. Probably even more exaggerated by the fact you can see there's a second shoe here, but so the second leg is under and it's not even in shot. So it seems to narrow down just the one, into the yellow tights onto the 1 foot. But you get this whole kind of real pointy, distorted sense out of it. And to really go for Adrian's bit, which is get down from the shoe for the orientation, this was another shot we did with Chelsea, where again, so sitting on a stool, legs crossed. I mean, Chelsea has long legs, not quite as long as they appear in here, but she tends to have long legs anyway. She's quite tall. And then these shoes here have quite a bit of a platform on them, and just doing this shot here, where we are down literally at shoe level, shooting up the length of the leg. The whole thing becomes very, very distorted, and quite a lot of fun as well. So at this point, we're not looking at proper representation. We're looking at an energy, a vibe that we're trying to create with this notion, with the fashion. Vigi says her dress's abstract pattern adds to the depth. The lass in the orange. So Adrian says, forgive me if this is phrased. Sorry, I'm trying to read things on my tablet, but there's a little spot here where you can click for hearts or likes, and it covers half the text. So bear with me while I just try and see what it is you've written. You say, forgive me if this is phrased poorly, typing on the fly and on the hoof, and that's fine. Do you have to be careful and take note of being too revealing of certain areas of the subject of a person? Well, if I'm reading what you're saying right, then yes, obviously, depending on where you're standing, the kind of shot you're doing, whether you're not wanting, yes, if you're looking up a skirt, you've got to be careful with these kind of things. It all depends on the kind of photos you're doing and what you're... So, yeah, and I think that's just true of anything, that when you're taking a photo, you've got the idea in mind. You're also... The other thing here is that whenever I'm taking photos, I am collaborating with the subject. I'm collaborating with the model. And, well, I suppose maybe it's a little slightly important tangent, but something worth saying. One of the things that I know is slightly different about me, not to everybody, but to some portrait photographers, is there are quite a few portrait photographers out there, or people who photograph people, who... What they do is they have their image in their mind and they photograph the person, and they are imposing their vision on the person. The person themselves may just as well be a mannequin that is moved into place by the photographer. So it's all about the photographer's vision, and only about the photographer's vision. My approach has always been collaborative. I work with the person to create something that perhaps neither of us would have got on our own. That if the person I'm photographing was with a different photographer, they would have a different set of photos. If I was with a different model, I would have a different set of photos. Because the relationship that I then have, the collaboration we have, massively impacts the way something is turning out. So I don't just say, do this, do that. I will talk with them, and then I will get their ideas. But also within that, we have an idea of what we're trying to achieve. To go back to that notion of who's going to be looking at these photos, what reaction do we want from the person who's looking at these photos, means that things like, if we've got a shot where actually something is being revealed, upskirt, down blouse, whatever, which isn't supposed to be, and that's accidentally happened, then we don't use those photos. Those ones are deleted. So that idea of creating an accidental photo which then goes out and somebody's going to be uncomfortable because it's showing something that they didn't want shown doesn't really occur because I'm collaborating, and that also means that the person that I'm photographing is getting to see the photos either as I'm going, because I'm showing them in the back of the camera, or before they're released. I sit with them and go through them, because I'm not out there to make anybody feel uncomfortable. Quite the opposite. I'm creating photos to make people feel empowered and good about what's going on. So, hope that makes sense, Adrian. No, okay, so Adrian says not being accusatory, just a conversation point. No, absolutely, no, I get that. I know you're not accusing me of anything. But it's a good conversation point. It's important to understand that when you are photographing someone, what are you trying to do? Are you photographing them for your own titillation? Are you photographing them for a collaborative outcome? You know, that these things kind of need to be understood up front. VG says, in my experience, some of the models, they want to accentuate, and yes, we should talk to them and give what they want. Well, absolutely. I mean, you know, you can photograph somebody who's wanting to be a bit sexier, show off something, that kind of thing. But again, it's about understanding the person you're working with and what it is they're wanting out of their photos. Who are the photos for? Where are they going to be shown? And what reaction are you wanting from the person, from the people who are going to be looking at the photo? And once you understand that, wherever those boundaries are, the point is that they are agreed boundaries. And that notion of agreed boundaries is extraordinarily important. And something I think that can get missed by some people, because they're so focused on what they want to create, they're not necessarily taking into consideration what the subject is wanting out of it. So VG says yes, a very delicate line. Nick says, plus you have morals. Well, yeah, I mean, again, that's about that notion of collaboration. For me, it's an important aspect of my photography. I need to know that the subject is on board with what I'm doing. That's my whole approach, is collaborative. And Jeffrey says, high school photo shoots are becoming more complex. Ended up at a beach in 32 degrees Celsius heat, 4 hours, 3 clothing changes, felt like a fashion shoot, only had natural lighting. For a high school shoot, yeah, that's 32 degrees. Okay, you must be in some place. You're obviously not shooting in Scotland. That's, yeah, I can't even begin to imagine a shoot like that. So, all in all then, to come back to this notion of what are we talking, let's kind of summarise everything up that we've been talking about. So, in essence, what we're talking about is focal length. So, this notion of, are you doing a 20mm wide close-up? Are you doing a 200mm shot zoomed in? Okay, these are going to make a difference as to how distorted or otherwise the image is going to be. We're talking about the notion of aperture, how wide your lens is, so which is about depth of field. So how much is going to be in focus. And generally speaking, wider angle lenses tend to have a much deeper depth of field, so you're less likely to get things out of focus in the background. Zoom lenses tend to compress the depth of field, so you have a much narrower set of what's in focus. Now that can be really good for separating out the person from the background, but it also does mean you've got less room for manoeuvre, for mistake. That unless you've got one of these cameras which manages to really lock onto the eye or the face, sometimes you can just get it in focus, and then if you wobble slightly forward or back, or the model will, or the subject moves slightly forward or back, and suddenly the bit you wanted in focus isn't in focus, and the eye might be out of focus, and it might be the ear or the back of the head which is in focus, and that doesn't quite work out right. So that's something else. So your depth of focus, your aperture, but also the focal length of your lens. Then there's the notion of up from above, changes one kind of idea, from below gives you a different kind of idea, and then there's that notion of actually if you want to take that and play with it, you shove on something like a wide angle lens and then really get in close, or really go from high above, or really go from down below. And sometimes you can even do that on a kind of slightly more accidental level. I mean, I had this shot here where I was just out for a walk, and this cat came up to me quite friendly. I had my camera on, my phone on me, took a couple of shots of the cat walking along the wall, and then he just peered right into me. And so here, because the cat comes so close, we're getting maximum distortion. But it did fortunately focus on the front eye, and it ends up as quite a fun kind of shot. It's not the way you normally see a cat. So you can have that kind of thing as well. So hopefully then that's kind of giving you a sense of that notion of portraiture and camera angles, along with lens choice. So your lens choice, if you're trying to do ordinary portraits, or slightly more traditional portraits, or flattering portraits, or portraits, you're wanting to make sure that you've got a focal length of, more generally speaking, try and think 70mm or above. That's going to create minimum distortion of face. But if you're wanting to create things with energy and distortion and that off-kilter kind of almost David Lynch kind of feel to it, put a wide-angle lens on and get in close and create the distortions. So I hope that kind of hope that all makes sense to you. And at that point, what I should do is say that if you happen to have found these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining, all the rest of it, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can support these podcasts. Now, coming up then, next week. Last week I talked about... What did I talk about last week? What was the challenge? Suddenly my brain's gone blank on me for a moment. Capturing movement. Yes. So last week's podcast, episode 232, was all about that notion of capturing movement in photography. And I set a challenge for next podcast. So the next podcast is the Capturing Movement Challenge. So if you missed it or you want a reminder, go back and take a look at last week's podcast after this one. And whether it's a case of capturing movement with fast shutter speeds, with slow shutter speeds, with panning, with zooming, all these kind of things. Lots of information in the last one. And the idea is there, put your image in for next week and we can take a look at how everybody has interpreted this notion of the movement challenge. So try and get the photos into me by Friday. That will be the 21st of March. Because I have to have time to be able to organise these podcasts and put them together and gather all the information together. Saturday morning at the very latest, really. But really, ideally try and get it to me by Friday. But send in your images. You get an automatic 10 smug points for anything you enter. And then there's bonus 30, 20 and extra 10 smug points for those that I consider to be my sort of favourite in the top 3. So that's next week. The week after, when we get to the 30th, which was when clocks go forward here in the UK, and it's also Mother's Day, I'm going to be doing a feedback session. So that's an opportunity for you to send me your photos, and if you want to get something back, which if you've got a sticking point, if you've got a photo where it isn't quite doing what you wanted it to, you're not sure why, you were trying to get, or you're wanting to put it into a competition maybe, and you're wanting to make sure that there isn't anything missing, that any reason at all where you might want feedback, this is what that podcast will be about. So that will be in 2 weeks' time, and I have, generally speaking, about 4 slots for that, so get yours in early. I'll be doing them in a kind of first come, first served order. So if you have an image that you want feedback from, and remember there's very, very few places on the internet or anywhere at all where you can get genuine feedback from a professional photographer on your photos. That isn't going to cost you a fortune. So keep that one in mind. So next week then, the Capturing Movement Challenge. The week after will be a feedback session. Okay, so what have we got here? Adrian says, are you going to create a Flickr thread on the posting for next week's images? Yes, that's a good point. We have the Flickr group. Where are we? Just there, I think. Flickr.com/groups/UPwKA, UPwKA, Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. Stick your photos in the Flickr group, or if you're on Facebook, put them in the Facebook group, or send them to me, kim@kimayres.co.uk. Email them to me. Tell me a little bit about the photo. This is for the challenge for next week. any kind of interesting little story, why you took the photo, any little anecdotes. I tend to find the stories just as interesting as the photos. That can always be a bit of fun. And then we remember, this is sharing. We're sharing our ideas. Everybody's going to approach this challenge completely differently, and it's fun to see how other people have done it, because it's not just about me giving out information, it's about sharing information as well. So yes, in the Flickr group, I will set up a thread whereby you can post your images if you want to do it that way as well. I'll get that sorted out probably this evening, or certainly by tomorrow morning at the latest. What else have we got here? Oh, John says, really interesting topic today. Lots to think about. I'm glad you think so, John. VG says, eager to get out to take photos for the challenge. Excellent. Right, so I think that's us. So thank you to Nadia for coming up with the topic in the first place. Thank you to everybody who's chipped in comments, and as we go, it's so much more interesting doing these podcasts when there's feedback and we've got questions and we've got topics and input as we go as well. And I look forward to seeing you all next week, and looking forward to seeing what you put in for the Capturing Movement Challenge. Take care. Bye bye.